All right, so Sexual Assault Services of Saskatchewan acknowledges and honors the enduring presence of the people who have cared for this land for time immemorial. The Nehiyawak, the Nakawini-Niwak, the Dakota, Lakota, Nakota, and Denisoline, and the Métis-Michif Nation. We reaffirm our commitment to serving all of Saskatchewan treaty territories, including Treaties 2, 4, 5, 6, 8, and 10. We recognize that the spirit and intent of the treaties has not been fully honored, and that our communities suffer from the legacy of colonization, including dispossession, discrimination, and systemic violence. Thus, as treaty people, we are committed to decolonizing our work, our practice, and our relationships as we confront the injustices that continue to impact people's lives today. We are dedicated to moving beyond acknowledgement by building relationships and working in partnership with Indigenous peoples in the spirit of truth, reconciliation, humility, respect, and reciprocity. I'm now going to introduce the Enough Already program before I let our presenter take it away. Enough Already is a program offered by Sexual Assault Services of Saskatchewan. Enough Already seeks to prevent and address sexual harassment in Saskatchewan workplaces. We are committed to working with governments, businesses, industry associations, unions, community organizations to make workplaces across Saskatchewan safe for everyone. Sexual Assault Services of Saskatchewan is a provincial nonprofit organization that works collectively with frontline agencies, community partners, and governments that provide support and advocacy for those affected by sexual violence in Saskatchewan. We support our 13 member agencies and our partners throughout the province with research, education, policy development, and advocacy. This virtual conference is part of our Sexual Violence Prevention Month offerings, which you can learn more about at www.sassk.ca/SVPM. And I'm going to put that all in the chat in just a moment. We're really happy to be able to offer this conference at no cost to the participants, and that is because of our funders. The Law Foundation of Saskatchewan is our Enough Already program funder, and SIGA, Service Hospitality, Sleek Signs, Saskatchewan Union of Nurses, and SGI Canada are our Sexual Violence Prevention Month sponsors. We just thank them for their generosity. We would not be able to do this without them. One final note is that today's topics may bring up difficult memories, emotions, and thoughts, and I encourage you all to take the space that you need and care for yourself. Please take breaks as you need them, and if you're looking for more support, I'm going to put into the chat links to resources throughout Saskatchewan and Canada if you're looking for more immediate support. And I'll put them up right after I finish my introductions. So let us introduce today Sean Tucker. Sean is a professor of occupational health and safety at the University of Regina. He's currently working with us to address barriers to accessing systems that support workers who experience work-related sexual harassment. Sean will be joined today by Patience Umera-Wineza, who is the Sexual Assault Services of Saskatchewan Director of Policy and Research, and she oversees the Enough Already program. So without further ado, take it away, Sean.
Thanks a lot, Tal. It's great to be here. So I am a professor at the U of R, and I teach an undergraduate and graduate class in occupational health and safety. I've taught that class now for 15 years, and sexual harassment, sexual violence is part of my course outline. And we have readings in there, including excerpts from a book. Bonnie Robichaud, who was the first person to took a case to the Canadian Human Rights Commission, ultimately the Supreme Court of Canada, to establish the legal principle that employers have responsibilities to prevent workplace sexual harassment and violence. I also do consulting work, so I work with organizations in Saskatchewan and others outside of the province, mostly conducting general surveys on health and safety, but I have conducted some surveys that relate to respectful workplaces and harassment generally in the workplace, but not specific investigations or surveys on sexual harassment in workplaces. But my consulting work has intersected with this, and so I have some experience with speaking with senior leadership teams and organizations about prevention in the workplace, which is really important. So, as Tal mentioned, today's talk our presentation is going to focus on systems in Saskatchewan that are exist for prevention, but also for supporting survivors. And so I'm going to go through that. That'll be towards the end of my presentation. And there are other presenters as a part of this series that are going to kind of dive deeper into the legal aspects. And so I'm not going to go into too much depth on the legal aspects, but I will have some slides related to that at the beginning of my presentation. And finally, at the start of the presentation, near the beginning, there's some new analysis of Stats Canada data that I'll be sharing here. And I welcome questions at any time in the presentation. We'll have time at the end as well for questions. So anything that I can help clarify, please raise your hand or put a question in the chat, and I'll do my best to address it. And feel free to follow up with me after the presentation as well if you'd like to chat about anything here. So in my work, I teach the OH&S class, and what I've seen, I guess, in the last 10 years is more literacy and awareness about harassment and sexual harassment in the workplaces, but we still have a lot of work to do. I still hear from too many students that they experience this in their workplaces, and sometimes I feel in our prevention work on OH&S that there's not enough attention on preventing sexual harassment in the workplace and on enforcement of the provisions in our laws in Saskatchewan. So I'll touch on that in the presentation as well. So I'm just going to share my screen here. And these slides will be available later if you would like. Okay. So just want to acknowledge the funders of the research and also patients, a couple people from the Canadian Hub for Applied Social Research at the U of S who've been helping out, and the WCB is the main funder of this project. So some of you may be familiar with this news story from last year. This is a Stats Canada survey that was done in 2020, and a report came out based on that survey and compared the prevalence of workplace harassment across Canada and found that Saskatchewan had one of the highest rates. And a quote from that survey that nearly 1 in every 2 women and more than a third of men had reported being harassed or sexually assaulted in their workplace. This survey that was done, the results are consistent with other surveys in Canada that have been done. Unfortunately, with this survey, we don't have access to detailed results for Saskatchewan. I'll speak to that in a moment. In terms of the legal environment, just to note off the top, and some are probably already familiar with this, but in Saskatchewan, there are federally regulated workplaces and provincially regulated workplaces. And so the vast majority of organizations fall under provincial legislation, and that's the Saskatchewan Employment Act right here. And the OH&S provisions in the Act are Part 3. There's a thicker book, and it's the Saskatchewan OH&S regulations, and Section 3-25 outlines the requirements for a harassment policy that employers are expected to have and implement in their workplaces. Now, about 10% of the workforce in Saskatchewan falls under federal regulation. So that's the Canada Labor Code. And this is generally business and operations that would be of an interprovincial nature, so transportation, banking, telecommunications, and some First Nations owned businesses would fall under the Canada Labor Code. The regulation is the Workplace Harassment and Violence Prevention Regulations. These were came into force in 2020 or 2021. And just make a comment on those. They are more robust and more comprehensive than the provincial OH&S regulations. So in terms of training provisions, they're more specific. There's a requirement that employers update their harassment policy every 3 years. There's risk factors that are listed in that regulation and comprehensive reporting requirements. So I'm going to focus on Saskatchewan's legislation. Again, this is just to kind of set up a more detailed discussion of the systems that we have in the province, but it's important to share a little bit about this. I know other speakers will go into more detail. So the Saskatchewan Employment Act, Part 3, defines three types of or forms of harassment. One based on a prohibited grounds, and so that would be in the Saskatchewan Human Rights Code, personal harassment or psychological harassment, and then thirdly, sexual harassment. And this was an addition to the Act in 2021. It used to be in the Saskatchewan Employment Act that workplace sexual harassment was defined in terms of gender or sex-based discrimination. And in 2021, they moved forward with a standalone definition of sexual harassment, which you can see here. Now, I want to now just share with you some of the analysis that we have done through the U of S on Stats Canada data, that 2020 study that I mentioned. And this just arrived a couple weeks ago in my email inbox. And so this is the first time we're sharing these results here. So when we think about the definition of harassment here, we think about the workplaces and workplaces where we might expect to see more or more prevalent cases of sexual harassment. What, maybe just in the chat, where do you think what kind of workplaces do you think we would see more higher prevalence of sexual harassment? Anybody want to comment in the chat there? I don't know if it's disabled. Maybe it is. So that's probably, I shouldn't ask the question. I think it's disabled. Oh, wait, we've got some healthcare. Yeah. Municipal government, restaurants, hospitality. Yeah. So see a wide range of work settings there. We looked at industry, and we looked at industry that where predominantly males worked in so men worked in industry. Sectors where there was 70% or more of employees that were men, and we compared the prevalence that men and women in those sectors experience to the prevalence that men and women experience in all other sectors. So I'm going to go through that with you. So there's the male-dominated, and I should say that the Stats Canada survey did ask about sex and not gender. So that's why you see the language here. So we looked at the sectors where they were male-dominated, and here they are. And the question that Stats Canada asked is what was the frequency or the experience workers had with experienced, seen, or heard inappropriate behaviors in a work-related setting one or more times in the past 12 months. So that was the lead-in, and what you're going to see in the results in the next couple slides is the percentage of men and women that experienced one or more times, experienced, seen, or heard, pardon me, one or more times of these inappropriate behaviors, which we would consider sexual harassment in the workplace. And you can see those there. So when we looked at the male-dominated sector, what we found here, and um, this is consistent, I think, with terms of prevalence, but we see um, that women in the male-dominated sectors experience more of these behaviors than men, with one exception on online sexually explicit material. Um, uh, Men reported higher frequency than women in this sector. And the yellow highlighting indicates a statistically significant difference. And 40%, just over 40%, reported experiencing, seen, or heard sexual jokes in the last 12 months. So when we look at all sectors, here's what we see. We see that, again, women in all sectors, all other sectors, I should say, also experience more of these behaviors than men in those sectors. And we also see, interestingly, that these two sexual jokes and the online sexually explicit material, we see it's more prevalent overall in the male-dominated sector. So going back to some of the um, sectors that were shared here, it's wide, it's broad-based in society and workplaces. And patients, I just wondered, do you have any, when you see these results,
Mhm.
and I know you speak with survivors, what do you hear, and what are your reflections on these results?
Right, right. So, our organization, SASS, and the Enough Already program is really interested in understanding how sexual harassment plays out. We have a strong understanding of sexual assault in itself. And looking at this data, I was talking to Sean about how it is consistent with a lot of the data that comes out around sexual assault in general, where um, we're seeing the progression of sexual harassment starts from the jokes. And then, as you can see, the highest rates are usually the ones that are less, might seem innocuous, like the jokes, but then the inappropriate comments is the next highest one, a person's appearance. Then we look at inappropriate conversations about their sex life, and it kind of progresses all the way until we get to inappropriate touching, which is sexual violence at that point. So one of the things I think that really came to mind as well was that in as much as men and women experience it differently, when it comes to workplaces, sexual harassment is one of the few forms of sexual violence that shows up in public. And so you see that men and women are both experiencing it. And when we talk about harassment, it's also just about exposure. So being exposed to it in itself is also harmful. And often for men, because harassment happens in a sort of like this group mentality, it's around calling in, it's sort of trying to rope in support from others. And so I think that is also why you see at times with certain forms of harassment having a higher percentage of men also being exposed to it, because the ones who are perpetrating, if I could use that term, are looking for camaraderie. And they're really, so this speaks to culture more than anything. And it speaks to the ways that we kind of participate, or we think it's appropriate to behave in workspaces. And, a couple other things I just wanted to note that there is the data for Saskatchewan is not great. And that's a huge part of why we're doing this study. But, the Stats Canada data did find that, broadly speaking, the rates for men was at 38% in terms of personal experience, 38% for men and 49 for women. So again, these numbers are not that off, from each other. And again, like saying that everybody's exposed to it, and gender inequality is the biggest driver of sexual harassment. And I also did mention to Sean that I thought, because this data was collected in 2020, it would be interesting to
Mhm.
see in another 5 years what has happened since then, because what we've heard on our end is an increase of sexual harassment through online spaces since COVID happened. And so, some of this data probably will shift over time. And I think lastly, I think because our province is we have a lot more industries that are male dominated because of our resource extraction industry, farming, oil and gas. I think that also contributes to some of the higher rates that we might experience compared to other provinces and territories.
Thank you, Patience. So in terms of the law, I'm going to focus on Saskatchewan here and noting that there are differences between provincial and federal law and regulation here. Responsibility is set out in legislation, and the employers have the greatest responsibility for preventing sexual harassment, sexual violence in the workplace. And that starts with just a general due diligence provision in the law about preventing workers from being exposed to harassment. And that the legislation doesn't use the term leadership and culture, but ultimately it does come down to that. Training is important. We have a general training provision in our legislation. It's not specific to preventing harassment, but that's included in there. I would like to see it explicitly mentioned, but it is a part of it. Sufficient and competent supervision is another requirement of or employer responsibility, I should say. And then developing and implementing a harassment policy, and those two words are really important: develop and implement. And we see employers that some that don't develop or implement, and we see some that develop but don't implement a policy. So those are really important. And then critically to investigate all incidents of harassment. And this is something that's changed in our legislation in recent years because some employers weren't investigating. And we know they still aren't, some employers, but now it's explicit and that expectation is there. Supervisors have responsibilities. So if you're a supervisor, you have a responsibility to prevent workers under your direct supervision from being exposed to harassment. And then workers as well have a duty to refrain from participating in the harassment of another worker. And for employers and supervisors, it's not just a coworker harassing or say somebody in management position harassing a frontline worker. It also involves patients and healthcare, clients, members of the public. So that provision around prevention applies broadly. It doesn't necessarily matter who's doing the harassment. It's a broad one. So, as Patience mentioned, that the culture piece is so critical here, and we could have an hour-long presentation on the importance of culture and leadership in this, but there's just sadly so many examples of organizations that really lack the culture and lack the leadership. Hockey Canada, thinking about that organization, thinking about the RCMP with its long-standing deep internal issues with harassment and violence within in the force. So many examples, and this is really important. So I just want to say a few words about this before moving forward to the discussion of, well, once prevention fails, now what are the systems that workers have access to? So I want to again stress that we always want to focus on the prevention side first, but we are going to talk about the systems when prevention fails. So those strong norms are really important in an organization. And, just thinking of consulting work that I've done, just obviously, I think, most people will, I think common sense, just because you don't have reports of harassment and sexual harassment in your workplace doesn't mean it doesn't exist. I mean, it's widely unreported, and because for a variety of reasons. And so one of the things that organizations need to do is kind of reflect on where they are. And one important step I think that they can take, which I recommend, is reaching out to SASS for some of their training that's available, or a third-party consultant to do a culture audit and find out kind of where they are. What I found in doing that work, though, is that even in a survey which you present as anonymous and confidential, is that um, uh, workers still are reluctant to share. And so when I'm doing this work, it's always a proviso that, you know, there still may be issues in the workplace, and it's hard to get at, but I think it's important to do these trainings, have that independent third-party audit, culture audit, to figure out where things are at in the organization. Leadership is really important. Is this a checkbox exercise, or is this something that means something to them? Like, would they feel comfortable having their son or daughter work at a location? Is that a safe environment for them? Training, ongoing education. And Patience and I were chatting about this presentation yesterday, and just really it's something that the organization takes very seriously. And we treat each other with respect, and we don't tolerate harassment and mistreatment. And that goes, one of the litmus tests for that is when people are working together and there's not a manager or supervisor present. Just do people, they treat with genuine respect each other, and when complaints are made, that no one is above the law. So in Ontario, some may be familiar with Frank Stronach, who is one of the wealthiest men in Canada, who owned Magna International, a auto parts manufacturer. And I think it's 3 years ago, news broke that he was, preying on younger women for decades in the organization. I can't remember now how many charges have been laid, but he was, kind of above the law. And we think back to Gian Gameshi, the case with CBC, and the third-party audit into that awful situation that uncovered this host culture, that some people in the organization were above the policies and practices of the organization. So that's also, a cultural indicator of how healthy that workplace is. And then, finally, a strong culture of prevention. If there are incidents that occur, that there are investigations, that they're conducted appropriately, and that there's corrective action, and afterwards reviewing, like, what were the root causes that led to that incident, having honest discussions about that, and reviewing the processes that responded to the incidents and the supports that were provided to the survivors. So all of these things are important in prevention. And what I want to turn to next is what happens when prevention fails and there is an incident. What systems do workers have to access in Saskatchewan? So most of our work in the project that we're currently undertaking is focused on the Ministry of Labor, Saskatchewan Human Rights Commission, and the Workers' Compensation Board. So I'll spend the most time on those pieces there, but I'm just going to go through each of them in some high level, and then more detail on 3 to 5 here. So as mentioned, in Saskatchewan law and the Canada Labor Code, if it's federally regulated, the employer has duties, and one of their duties is to investigate all complaints. They can't be selective in which complaints they investigate. They have to investigate. So typically, an employee's may approach a manager, someone in human resources, or their union, and investigations. Although it doesn't say in the regulations, there was a case not too long ago with the Saskatchewan Labor Relations Board, laid out kind of the expectation, the standard for investigations: impartial, thorough, procedurally fair, and conducted by a knowledgeable, competent investigator. So that's, I think, really important for employers. If there's supervisors or employers that are attending this presentation or watching a recording of it, I think this is really important after the effort going to prevention. If there is a complaint, to take a moment and think about the investigation and make sure that you've got the right person to look into the matter. Other requirements are outlined in Section 3-25 of the OH&S regulation, so confidentiality is important there. And as a part of that, there's a requirement for corrective action in the regulation, and that's the term that's used, but it's not defined. And the corrective action, I'd said earlier that the duty to prevent harassment applies to both other employees of the organization, but also clients, members of the public, patients if it's a healthcare setting. That corrective provision is corrective towards other people in the organization, but still is in carrying out due diligence, the employer would be expected to take action if it's not somebody that's employed by the organization. Next, unions. So roughly 30% of workers in Saskatchewan are unionized, and unions, so workers pay dues to a union, and by virtue of doing that and being a member of the union, there's a legal principle known as the duty of fair representation that applies to all members. So when a complaint is made, even if it's against another member, or let's say, another employee who's a member of the union has to represent the member. They can't be acting in an arbitrary, discriminatory, or bad faith manner with respect to representing their members. Unions are there to provide support for members. They can look at informal resolution of issues that arise in the workplace. They can file grievances on behalf of members alleging a violation of the collective agreement, and collective agreements do have provisions of anti-harassment provisions in them. So, and that's one of the levers that unions have to bring forward complaints from their members about sexual harassment in the workplace. They are required to represent both the complainant and the alleged perpetrator, even if they're in the same union. So they've got to represent both the members, and there's processes for that. I won't go into detail right now. And I also want to mention that unions are themselves organizations and have history current as well. Some unions have serious problems with harassment within their own union. And so they have anti-harassment policies and practices, and they are expected to abide by those and have their own investigation processes in place. But there have been instances in Saskatchewan and Regina where part of the issue is the union itself. When workers bring forward complaints, the union has not acted in a way that's consistent with what their responsibilities are or the law. So I just want to turn to a couple of results from a separate survey that was published in 2022, these results. So this is a Western University and Canadian Labour Congress survey of about 5,000 mostly unionized workers. So unlike the Stats Canada survey, it's not necessarily representative of the population here. And they asked about reporting outcomes for sexual harassment and violence. And they asked, reporting to a union, supervisor, manager, or formal report or grievance. And you can see here, sadly, that more more respondents to this survey, in most cases, said that it made matters worse than it made matters better. And that's really tough to see these results, but we know there's significant issues with the reporting in organizations, and the greatest proportion said it just made no difference. Now, they had a similar different twist on the question. Satisfaction with actions taken by those responsible for workers' safety and well-being among those who experience sexual harassment and violence. And there was a continuum here from very dissatisfied to very satisfied. And in relative terms, the greatest satisfaction is with the union rep here. So lots of work to do here. We look at these results here to supervisor, manager, HR rep, lots of work to do. And SASS is doing this work in Saskatchewan, as are others. And it's really, really important work to move these numbers. These are Canada-wide results. And there's a longer report that I'd be happy to share with folks if you'd like a copy of that. So that's a high level of the employer and of the union role in the response. Now let's turn to three kind of bodies that we don't often maybe think of immediately when we think of workplace sexual harassment and violence. Ministry of Labor Relations and Workplace Safety. So this is the regulator in Saskatchewan, and they're responsible for, in OH&S, ensuring compliance with the provisions of the Saskatchewan Employment Act and OH&S regulations. They also investigate incidents. They put forward prosecution files to the prosecutor in the Ministry of Justice. They'll investigate complaints. They're not, they do a little bit of education, but not much. That's other separate organizations do that in the province. So they're the regulator. And they do have a process for investigating, and I'm just going to go to my notes here, for investigating complaints related to workplace harassment in general and sexual harassment specifically. So there's an intake form, which I took a screenshot here. They have occupational health officers, as they're known, so like safety inspectors, and they have a dedicated group related that deals with complaints related to workplace harassment and what's known as discrimination. But discrimination, that refers to discrimination, an employer discriminated against employee for exercising their rights in the act. Okay, so not the way we might think of discrimination based on protected grounds. And so workers in Saskatchewan can make a complaint to the ministry for harassment, and they do have a dedicated branch, as I said. So I'm just going to go through my notes on the process because I did follow up with the ministry about this before earlier on. So they will ask, did you follow up with your employer about this? Do they have a policy in place? And you can see that on the intake form. Have you submitted a harassment complaint internally? Once they receive the initial intake form, the worker will be contacted by telephone, and the intake form will be assessed. There's I think a more detailed, more information is collected then, and the occupational health officers will look into the matter. Now, there's been, since September 2022, there's been 102 sexual harassment inquiries at the ministry. What happens then after a complaint is made? So the officers have pretty broad powers. They can conduct an inspection of the workplace. And in cases where they determine that an employer has not complied with legislative requirements with dealing with a workers' harassment complaint, officers can issue a notice of contravention to compel compliance with these requirements. So in terms of potential outcomes of the Ministry of Labor Relations and Workplace Safety, they can investigate the matter. Does the workplace have a policy in place? Have they developed a policy and have they implemented? Those are two different things. They can conduct a work site visit and they can issue compliance orders. Those do not come with financial penalties. And in terms of prosecutions in Saskatchewan, we generally prosecute serious injuries, physical injuries, and fatalities. And there's been no prosecutions of harassment, sexual harassment, sexual violence, or violence in general. There's been no prosecutions, to my knowledge, in Saskatchewan. Are there any questions about the ministry's role before I move on? So I would say I'll maybe add a comment here. I would say pretty limited in terms of what the ministry can do currently. I would like to see them have an enforcement tools where they can issue financial penalties to organizations that are not taking their responsibilities seriously related to sexual harassment in the workplace. And I'd like to see prosecutions as well. That would send a strong message. The Human Rights Commission is obviously broader kind of scope and jurisdiction than the Ministry of Labor. So we're looking at schools and workplaces and public spaces. So they're there to ensure that and prevent discrimination based on the protected grounds in the Human Rights Code. So employment is one domain, the workplace is one domain, and my understanding is the intake to make a complaint is similar if it's workplace or non-work related. So it's the same intake form which you see pictured here on this slide. And without going into detail, once a complaint is made, the commission would reach out to, in this case, if it's an employer, reach out to the employer, collect information from them. There's a chance for response, and then different processes can take place. Mediation is one. There may end up with a voluntary settlement, and the range that I've stated here on the slide, $8,000 to $20,000. I just want to be clear. The Human Rights Commission website has examples of settlements that have been reached, and they have 3 of them related to harassment in the workplace, and those ranges were from $8,000 to $20,000. So those are just kind of examples. Income replacement as well, if someone has been fired for making a complaint. If someone's been, in fact, constructively dismissed, the work conditions are so toxic they have to leave. So income replacement. And there's a possibility that the commission may wish to take the matter to provincial court, which is quite uncommon in Saskatchewan. Still seeking statistics from the Human Rights Commission on the number of work-related sexual harassment and violence complaints that they receive. Lastly, the Saskatchewan Workers' Compensation Board. And patients, I'm looking at the clock here, and I said 35 minutes, and now we're up to 45 minutes already. And sorry, I've
that's
gone
okay.
on a bit longer here. So the Saskatchewan Workers' Compensation Board. So just briefly, the WCB, where it originated, so the principles behind the Workers' Compensation Board have existed in law for over 100 years in Canada. Saskatchewan's WCB was established in 1930, and it's important to understand this. WCBs are entirely funded by employer premiums. They don't receive any funding from government, and they're arm's length from government. They have a board that the government appoints of both labor and employer representatives and a chair. The key thing about the WCB system is that um, in exchange for 100% employer funded insurance, workers gave up the right to sue. Okay. And this is really important when we think about any workplace injury, but especially for sexual harassment violence. So when a worker seeks compensation through the WCB, and that might be related to lost wages, it may be for medical treatment, any other supports that the worker might need as part of their recovery. In doing so, you give up the right to sue. And that's a long-standing principle with the workers' compensation system. Okay. So what qualifies as a work-related injury? This is the definition on the Saskatchewan WCB's website. So it's any work-related event. So that can be on-site or off-site. And I failed to mention this at the beginning. I talked about the Stats Canada survey. They asked about experience of those behaviors in on the work site or during work-related travel, at work-related social events, um, training sessions that are off-site, these types of things. So it the, when the WCB uses the term work-related, it's not just the work site. So it would include all a broad range of spaces. Um, any event that causes the need for medical treatment and or time away from work, they adjudicate on an individual basis informed by policy, policy that is off continually being reviewed and updated. Um, so the WCB in the past decade has established a dedicated psychological injury unit within the WCB, and they do have received cases, about 144 in the last 10 years, pardon me, related to work-related psychological injury caused by sexual harassment in the workplace. Okay, so they do cover psychological injury. And you can find this on their website. They refer to a substantial work-related stressor, and that would qualify as a psychological injury. And they cite the example of sexual harassment, bullying. They use different language in there, but sometimes, some people might immediately think of psychological injury, worker, first responder, for example, a paramedic, right, with very traumatic event and PTSD. And I just want to share with everybody that these psychological injuries at work, it's really important that we recognize them. I know there's a lot of stigma about reporting, but the WCB is there to compensate. If it occurs in the workplace, it's a work-related injury. You're duly entitled to compensation for lost injuries, to any support that you need. So here are the claims. Some stats on here: about 10 to 15 claims per year. Most are from women. I just want to note on the average duration, it varies widely, but these are higher than average, than the overall average of the WCB. And I think in the chat we saw early on, top sectors: healthcare, urban rural government, community and social services are the top ones. I spoke with somebody at the claims manager in the claims department at the WCB, and they receive very few claims per year, and generally they find that it's workers that's after it's gotten quite serious, the matter where they've had to maybe leave the workplace because it's so toxic, then they're coming to the WCB, and I think they want the public to know that the WCB is there, and to make complaints for them, and that people may not be aware that they are there to provide wage replacement and other supports to workers. And mindful of time, in terms of other legal options, there's a couple, enough already, and Tal and Patience have spoken about that already, which excellent resources. I've had folks come and speak to my OH&S class at the U of R. It's a great presentation. And then this one here, Larry, I know we were online here. Thanks for sharing this with me. So Shift plea, I really recommend going through here. So this is an excellent initiative in Saskatchewan, provides some legal support, legal advice for workers who've experienced sexual harassment at work. And there's a request for referral option on the website. So looking forward with our project here, we are working on a survey, developing a survey to understand workers' perceptions of the systems that I just discussed, the barriers, the opportunities in those. I think we're going to look at a jurisdictional scan and recommendations, project reporting later this year and into 2026. Sorry that went a bit longer. First time ever.
Thank you so much, Sean. I think you shared a lot there, and really appreciate the time that you've given to us and your wealth of knowledge. And before I open it up to questions, I just want to also just mention that this initiative that we're looking at, I think as you've seen the numbers that Sean shared, they're quite low. When we started this initiative, we thought, let's look over the last 10 years to see how many people have reported to labor relations, to WCB, to Saskatchewan Human Rights. And we were really surprised that 102, 140, right? When you consider how high the probability that the rates are for our province. And so that's one of the things that we're really trying to address is the understanding that, first of all, there are options for workers to report, but we're also looking at the systems themselves to say, how accessible are you for a worker to report? You know, we're going to be looking forward, we're going to be looking at the claims processes, how are they assessing what's an injury? You know, what are some of the challenges or barriers perhaps that, you know, those processes would apply in other forms of injury, but are not applicable in sexual harassment due to the unique contexts that are tied to sexual harassment cases. So that's what we're hoping to uncover, because we do hear a lot of stories of just workers who've gone through these systems and it's been really, really tough for them. And so we're looking at ways of how we can address those barriers and truly understand sexual harassment as a form of injury. The other thing that I always want to mention, because we work not just in this context, but in the much more severe forms of sexual violence, is workplace sexual harassment, I really truly believe is sort of like a training ground for a lot of folks who end up committing egregious forms of sexual violence. When we look at stories of survivors who've experienced, you know, especially any kind of sexual assault, they've said, oftentimes it started at work, or that at work it started as those minor jokes, the images being shared at their desk, you know, inappropriate comments. And when they're not addressed, when they are not, their intervention doesn't happen, it continues to progress because it really kind of empowers that individual who's behaving badly, right? And that can progress to sexual assault. And so we say that when you address it at work, you not only protect your workers, but you protect society as a whole. And we're trying to, you know, sort of put that onus back to employers around their responsibilities, to workers around how you behave around others, but also to our systems around how well are you responding? Do workers know that you're there as a resource for them? And are your processes appropriate for the injuries and the conditions that people are facing? So that's what this initiative is, and we're really excited to share with you ongoing as to what we'll be uncovering as we continue, and as well as building a baseline understanding for our province so that we have good data that informs good policies. With that being said, I'd love to open it up. If anyone has questions, we'll stick around past 1, but I just thought we would kind of let you have most of the information before we open it up.
I see there was a question in the chat around remedies
Right.
For workers who experience sexual harassment and go through the Human Rights Commission, WCB, but that's not really a remedy. I mean, I guess the remedy is replacing wage replacement, psychological supports. Unfortunately, on the OH&S side, we don't, unlike falls from heights, other types of injuries, electrocution, come in contact with moving equipment, we see large penalties, hundreds of thousands of dollars, but there are no cases currently, and there are no tools that our regulator has for responding to an employer that shows a clear pattern of not taking the responsibility seriously and hurting people and that's a problem. We need to address that, and Saskatchewan's not alone in that. So I don't know if that helps. It's the civil cases. I couldn't really comment on those, Larry, but those are just some thoughts.
I can take the next question, which is from Maria, as to why do you think it makes things worse for so many once they report? The reason really is because the way sexual harassment plays out in workplaces is set up within our real world context where to date, there's still a lot of stigma tied to it. And there's a false perception that folks are lying about it. We don't necessarily have the data on false reporting rates in workplaces, but what we do know is it's hard. We're trying to encourage people to take all complaints as good faith complaints, right? Treat them appropriately, have good processes, and investigate. But because oftentimes the report is about someone in the workplace that someone knows, it's someone's friend, it's someone's, there's kind of this thing of you're causing issues, you're going to make matters worse. And so then the onus often then goes back to the worker who complained to really sort of prove themselves. And then it causes a lot of tension, right, in that workplace. We also find that there are so many hoops that often people have to go through to just get the right information and to put their complaints in on time. So it causes a lot of stress. And in itself, I know Sean mentioned how long it takes to process them in WCB. And that's really because, psychological injuries come with a lot of impacts around mental health, depression, insomnia, headaches, all those kinds of like physical impacts to them. But then also when the process is quite drawn out and it touches so many areas that are not necessarily well understood, bringing that person back to work is even tough. If there are lingering kind of tensions at work, the mental health impacts continue, right? So then that person doesn't really find a way to reintegrate back to work, and then they're off work again. So it really drags out. And what we say whenever we go to workplaces and train them, we say, when a complaint comes in, just let it be processed, stay out of it, allow the due process to go through it. Don't contribute, don't make matters worse, don't have opinions around it. And if you have good processes in place, things will get resolved a lot quicker and there would be a lot better outcomes for everybody involved. So I hope that answers to that. But and we always also encourage non-retaliation because sometimes it's the employer, but oftentimes it's colleagues. That's what we've heard, especially in small communities. And it's such innocuous incidents, like sometimes not innocuous, but for example, one community, it's the person who's harassing might be a patron to the business, right? Let's say it's a small community and they really value the business from one person in that community who's well known, but they're harassing, let's say, their young workers. And so that person complaining, everyone at their work is saying, but now you're causing us to lose money from that person, right? And so we've really had to say to them, like, what matters more, the money that's coming from that patron or the health and well-being of your workers, right? And that sense of responsibility for one another. So those stressors come from all places, right? And it causes a lot of impacts to that person being harassed. And other workers see what's happening. So then that also becomes a deterrent. If they see that X, so-and-so, if Jane reports, this happens, why am I going to report, right? So then it becomes a culture. So that's what we're trying to prevent. I hope that answered. Sean, do you have anything to add about that?
We go back to the culture part of it there. organizations with a toxic culture that enable and support this behavior don't have policies, they don't implement policies, they don't have processes in place. So, by someone stepping forward and courageously reporting, you're almost kind of taking on this whole structure and power system in doing so. And that's the story of where did my book go here? Yeah, Bonnie Robichaud. I mean, she was worked on the civilian side in the Canadian Forces in Petawawa. It's between the lines published this book, and that's what she was confronted in the late 70s and early 80s.
And one of the things we found that works well is this, even though there's a lot of taboo around talking about sex, sexual harassment really is about the harassment part. It's a power thing, right? And so we always say to employers that the best way to prevent it is to actually talk about it and make it front and center. You don't shun away from it. You say, this is our work culture. We don't tolerate this behavior. This is what we commit and we stand for. And any complaints that are being brought forward will be treated seriously. When you're really upfront and kind of, non-committal, like you have a strong and committed stance about it, we find that those workplaces fare a lot better than those that allow things to sort of go underground. And again, no reports doesn't mean that nothing's happening. And so, in fact, in some cases, when we go in, we say to them, you might have increase in reports after we leave. And that means that they're trusting you, that they're now ready to come forward and speak up. So, it's one of those things where we have to kind of shift our mindset as well.
Yeah, so that I so true, patience. And I was going to make a comment on just general OH&S. So we see workers with PPE on, and like there's just a lot of default things we do with health and safety now, and which is so great. It's wonderful to see. But what we need to do is kind of bring the prevention and implementation of policies around harassment in the workplace up to that same level. Like we've made a lot of progress here, but we're working on it here, and I think SASS is doing just amazing work, and it's going to make a difference. But I don't know, employers think it's not going to happen here. It doesn't exist. And then so when someone brings forward is like, well, how could this isn't our fault, this is somebody else's fault. We have no processes in place. I just want to sweep this under the rug, so to speak, and they don't know what to do. And sometimes they don't call a lawyer. Sometimes they don't have maybe a dedicated person in HR, so they don't know the law, and it gets mishandled right away. And so I think there's all sorts of reasons for it, but patients, like that's it. It's the prevention. It's being the training, talking about it.
Thank you. Thank you so much. So if your workplace or anyone that would benefit from this training, SASS is able to provide kind of that customized training for workplaces across the province. We travel where we can. Right now, we have paused our in-person trainings, but we will be resuming them soon. And we can do that. Kind of we'll come in on site and talk to managers and employers as to what their workers need. But we also provide trainings and consultations with employers to also look at their policies and their procedures. And really, all of this is non-punitive. It's talking about like, how do we just have a better and safer workplace? How do we create procedures and policies for you so that you can go back into the business of doing whatever it is that you're here to do, right? So that's a resource that SASS is able to provide. We also have online courses that folks can take on their own time. They're about 60 to 75 minutes. They give certificates at the end of it. And Sean also mentioned Shift, they have legal advice that can be given to workers anywhere, 2 hours at the minimum, free legal advice, confidential, where a worker can share what's happening with them. And a lawyer, an employment lawyer who's trained can then say, these are some of the options that you have, right? And I think the idea is really we're trying to raise awareness for everyone, as well as raise kind of understanding of everyone's responsibilities along with their rights when it comes to this issue. So reach out to us anytime if you need anything, and we're really thankful that you've decided to spend your lunch hour with us today. And thank you, Sean, for your wisdom in sharing all this stuff with us.
Thank you, Patience. Thank you, Cal. Thanks, everybody.